We're going to be working on an asymmetrical one today. If you've got the black and brown and white international edition, that would be on page 130. And you've got one dart that starts at the bust point and comes to the opposite side, and then the other dart is parallel to the first one, and then it curves into the waistline. If you find this to be confusing for the one you're going to turn in, you're welcome to just do 2 parallel lines and use that line instead. So you could do 2 straight lines, but I'm going to demonstrate the way that it is in the book. Anytime you work on something that's asymmetrical, it works better if you trace your basic pattern onto both sides. So you'll need to put 2 pieces of paper together if you're working half scale, or use a little bit larger paper if you were doing this in full scale. So trace on the left and the right side. Now I could have done some of this a little bit more easily by pivoting. Because I'm going to move the dart. So it's going to work better if I move both of these darts out of the way. So in the example in the book, they have you start by moving both of the darts into the armhole so that they're not in the middle of the area that you're going to put the finished darts. I'm going to leave room for seam allowance on the side. Draw a straight line from my bust point to the armhole on both sides. And slash one dart leg on each of the darts, and then the new design line, and then close both of the original darts. And I'm going to go ahead and trim some of this off of the inside. Oh, I separated it. I'll just put it back where it belongs. So I'm gluing down what's going to be the underside. And because we're going to cut through this again, it works a lot better if you make sure it's well glued down all the way. And then I want to start from the bust point and work my way out rather than going the opposite direction, because I want to treat it as if it was still attached. Okay, so I've moved both of my darts into the armhole, just like the picture. And then it's showing this as being parallel. So I've got my curve, and I can decide where I want to put it. I can put it anywhere along there, but I want it to be parallel again, going the other way. So I might have to experiment with that a little bit. And if I'm working in pencil, and typically we work in pencil, but it's harder for it to show up. So if I go with something parallel from the bust point on the other side, it's going to be roughly 2 inches. Mine is just less than 1 7/8. So I've started at the bust point at 3 and then come out the other way. So if I flip this over and I start at 3, then I can be parallel for part of the way. So this part is parallel. And then I'm going to flip the curve over and draw a curved line right there. But because that's a design line, I can choose where those lines go. So if instead of using 2 parallel lines that are parallel through here, 2 curved lines, if that's just too frustrating, you could do 2 parallel lines that are straight, that would come across here and end there. So it would be the same concept, but I'm going to use the curved lines. And then I'm going to cut all the way along that new dart line to the bust point. And I'll do that on both sides. Okay, so I have my original, and I've cut on my design lines, and because there's not going to be anything to glue to, I'm going to make sure this paper is big enough to go behind that original dart, and I'm going to cut 2 of them. Okay, so now I'm going to close that dart and close that dart, and I now have 2 new darts so that it looks like the picture. And to fill that in, I'm going to put glue on a separate piece of paper and mend them together kind of like a band-aid. I'll still have to trim out this little part. And this time I'll be more careful not to go past that. Okay, so I've got it nice and smooth and flat. And I'll trim this out of the way. And now I just need to add seam allowance to it. So you've got your neck and your armhole, cut into the armhole, parallel section, and another dart. And on this one, we're going to fill in behind this with your seam allowance. This one, you probably could use seam allowance if you're going straight, but since this is set up to be a curved dart, you can't sew a curved dart with a flap. So we have to add seam allowance there, and it's handy if I could have done this in advance, but if you give yourself a notch on both sides and make sure that that's perpendicular to the line, it makes it easier to sew if you have a little notch there. And I'll put one on the other side. This one's a little less tricky, so I'll only put on one. So I've got 2 notches here and 1 notch there. And I'm going to go ahead and put my colored paper behind it. Can I get them both at once? I can. It's a miracle. Okay. Well, I can, but the question is, can I figure it out again? Now, I wasn't careful that time. I need to start from the point and smooth it as I go so that it stays flat. And I was so slow. Oh, that side looks like it's stuck down okay. Interesting to me how I always have a more difficult time when I'm making a video. Okay, so I've added my additional seam allowance, or the section for the additional seam allowance, and now I'm just going to use the side of my ruler and add 1/4 of an inch along here. And right through here, we're going to want to look at that a little bit extra. Because we want to make sure that there's ease there. At least typically we would. But I find that when the darts are coming from the outer edge and coming right into the center, rather than coming from an outer edge, when it's coming in between the bust points, the way this is, not quite exactly, but you don't need as much ease when you're right here in the middle. So you could back that out a little bit and blend it a little bit more. And if you were sewing that together, that would be something that would be interesting to test and see whether it would look better with that little bit of extra ease out or not. But it seems to me I usually end up taking it out when it's coming from the center like that. So on some of the others that we're going to do that actually go from the center out, we'll look at that again. And then you'll put your seam allowance around the outer edge because it's going to go all the way around the outside. And I think if it were me, whatever color paper you've got, if you had a marker that matched, so I would probably find a pink one and I would fill in the outer edge with pink marker. You can do it the way you want to, but make it look nice. If you're using pen, it's harder to see if you just squiggle. It looks a lot nicer if you use a highlighter or something like that, if you're using ink on the seam allowances instead of cutting the paper out. So I came out 1/4 of an inch on that side, so I'm going to end that a little early. But I think you've got the idea behind this one. Just make sure that you get your seam allowance added all the way around the outer edge. And when you draw the picture, it will look like that. So the last thing that you have to decide on this is how to do your grain. And the grain can be a number of different ways. This one could be something fun. So if you imagine that this was a stripe, you would get some really interesting angles happening. You could keep it from the center front and make this line parallel to the grain down here and have your grain be parallel that way so that it's visually centered if you were using a plain fabric. Or you could find the original center front at the waist and the top and put your grain there. So this one is going to be dependent on what kind of fabric you've got and how you want it to look. But I suspect the more logical way, well, either of those is logical. But if you were doing a stripe and it were coming from the center front right there, it would look better around the face if it were straight. This is probably something that you would do with a solid. And if I were using a solid fabric, I would probably do this one. But you could also turn it and just make it on the bias. So this is one of those where the grain is part of the design and there isn't one right answer. So add your seam allowance and cut it out the rest of the way. Make sure you retain the shape of the curves. I find it easier to be accurate if I put the ink side of the ruler down, even though on some of the rulers that tends to be upside down for the numbers. Make sure your seam allowance is the same 1/4 of an inch here as it is here on this side. Sometimes people get a little sloppy with this and the curve ends up more than 1/4 of an inch. So if you have a hard time with that, do your little dot to dot closer together. Right here you can see where there's a change. And when I was marking the outer edge of that, I actually straightened that up, even though it wasn't straight before. When I measured out, I took an average. So because it's the shape of the outer edge of the piece that counts and not where the actual stitching line is drawn, my line is nice and smooth. And I missed the edge of that line, so I went back and fixed it. This one's because it's going to be larger than the size of a scanner. It will be easier for you to photograph it than scan it. But when you put it in your book, you'll have to fold it once so that it will fit inside the page protector on the page. And you'll learn from my mistake and not do that right there. Right here I've got 2 layers of paper, and the one underneath didn't come out as well. So you'll have to go back and tidy them up. And when you put this on a page, try and make most of it fit, and then just take a little section of it and fold it over so that it stays attached. And I'm going to choose the grain line that I like the best. And that's the line I'm using for my grain line. Don't forget to put on your name. This one is asymmetric parallel darts. Cut 1, size 8. Take a picture of it first, and then you can just fold it to put it in your book. And put your picture wherever you would like to. If you extend this ruler line with the shoulder out and put a little mark right there on the corner, zoom in some more, and extend this line so that it's still lined up with that, and put a little mark opposite. Then you can draw a line from corner to corner and trim that little bit off on both sides. You're also going to want to line your ruler up with the seam allowance and extend your notches out so that they're perpendicular to the seam allowance. And this one's a little tricky because in the fabric, you'll be able to move the fabric around so that you can tell how well this lines up, because you'll sew it right sides together, and you're going to have to start sewing from the center out as you come around. So this notch is going to line up exactly on top of that notch. And by the time you get around to the other side, the paper's a little difficult, especially if you have multiple layers. So I'm turning that around and lining up those two notches. And that little bit hangs over the edge. So that needs to be cut off. I have a hard time staying on the screen when I have it zoomed in. Pre-mitering is your friend. And same thing on that one, but it works okay.